This is TWiT.
So, according to a recent survey of all mail servers visible on the internet, 57%, that is 507,389, are running Exim. And after seeing what Qualys found, I'm very glad I don't run Exim. I'm Windows-based rather than Unix or Linux-based, and Exim is running on the most popular OS for the internet, which of course is Unix or Linux. And if everyone listens no further, if you have in any way, or if you are in any way connected to one of those more than 500,000 email servers present on the public internet, you really should update to the latest release of Exim immediately. The vulnerability, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, was accidentally but fortuitously patched with the release of Exim version 4.92 back in February. It was 4 months ago, not 4 weeks ago. So back on February 10th, so almost exactly 4 months ago, it was accidental because the Exim team had no idea that they were fixing a major security hole. Qualys was just doing a review of the code, and in doing the code review, they found a big problem. The news hit last Wednesday. That is, Qualys went public with this. They sent a note to the Debian group, because Debian's email server is by default Exim. So the news of this breach, and this was a full disclosure, so all the bad guys know exactly how to pull this off, and that's what I'm going to explain here in a minute. But what's interesting is due to the weird nature of this, in its default configuration, it takes 7 days to cause a vulnerable remote email server to execute commands under the control of the attacker. So if upon the release of this news last Wednesday, someone began to attack your email server immediately, they're still waiting until tomorrow to be able to execute the commands that they've set up.
That's so weird. That's kind of unprecedented. I don't.
Is it? I know
really
it is. It really is. It's because of an expiration in an unsendable piece of email that it defaults to a week.
Okay.
And so
it keeps trying for 7 days. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So what happens is you keep the connection up and you send it a byte every 4 minutes because there's a different expiration after 5 minutes.
Oh, how funny.
And by sending it a byte every 4 minutes, you keep it waiting, and you do that for 7 days. And then a different expiration kicks in, which, due to this weird code path that they found, causes you basically you put the commands you want to have it run as the email address before the @ sign on the domain. And what happens is the way this thing trips over its own feet is that after a week of your patiently sending it a byte every 4 minutes, it will finally give up, and it ends up running this email address through a function which will accept the exec, the exec function, and take the rest of the parameters in the address as commands at root, commands with root privilege. So again, this is one of those problems that, because it was introduced back in, I've got it in my show notes here. I don't see it in front of me right now. I'll get to it. But it was introduced in 2016, early in 2016. So most of 2016, all of 2017, all of 2018, and up until the beginning of 2019. But the point is, probably any system that came up then that has not been updated in the last 4 months would have had one of the vulnerable versions of Exim. And of all of the more than 1 million internet email servers, 57% of them that are answering on port 25 SMTP, and what other ports may be susceptible, there are, we know, 507, 389 of those are vulnerable. So this seems bad. And it also seems the idea that an attacker with some patience, you gotta have a little patience, you gotta wait a week, could then execute the commands of their choice as root on an email server. I mean, these are going to be email servers of big targets potentially. IBM and Fortune 500 companies are going to be running Unix servers with Exim on it, and let's hope that they've been keeping them current. That is to say that they have updated, in the last 4 months, a server that went online the previous 3 years, because if not, I wouldn't be surprised if they got some commands being run on them as root. So let's see. In my notes, I have Qualys wrote to the Linux distro maintainers that the vulnerability is, quote, trivially exploitable, unquote, and expects attackers to come up with exploit code in the coming days. Exim 4, the affected version, is currently the default MTA, the mail transfer agent, on Debian Linux systems. A large number of Exim installations exist, especially within ISPs and universities in the UK. Exim is also widely used within the GNU Mailman mailing list manager and cPanel. Wikipedia notes that, quote, Exim's security has had a number of serious security problems diagnosed over the years. Since the redesigned version 4 was released, there have been 4 remote code execution flaws and 1 conceptual flaw concerning how much trust it is appropriate to place in the runtime user. The latter was fixed in a security lockdown in revision 4.73, one of the very rare occasions when Exim has broken backwards compatibility with working configurations. And of course, now we have another biggie. Qualys put out a security advisory calling this the return of the wizard, RCE in Exim, so remote code execution. And for anyone who's interested, this is CVE 2019-10149. And I pretty much covered this in summary, so I'm just going to try to find things that are important things that I didn't. They wrote, during a code review of the latest changes in the Exim mail server, we discovered an RCE vulnerability in versions 4.87 to 4.91 inclusive. And what I tried to look to see whether the hello message divulges the version of Exim. Sometimes the hello message, or there's also a version of it, hello, on more advanced, more recent versions, sometimes says, Exim version something, which of course the bad guys would love to have, because then on immediately, on any, answering any connection, TCP connection over port 25, the server would be basically waving a flag saying, please hack me. I'm vulnerable. I don't know whether Exim does, so that would be one thing to find out. But of course, even if not, chances are very good that it would be vulnerable. They said in this particular case, RCE means remote command execution, not remote code execution. An attacker can execute arbitrary commands with exec as root. No memory corruption, no return-oriented programming, nothing fancy, no buffer overflows and so forth is required. They said this vulnerability is exploitable instantly by a local attacker. So that's also worth noting. Instantly by a local attacker. They said, and by a remote attacker in certain non-default configurations. That is instantly exploitable by a remote attacker in certain non-default configurations. To remotely exploit this vulnerability in the default configuration, an attacker must keep a connection to the vulnerable server open for 7 days by transmitting 1 byte every few minutes. However, because of the extreme complexity of Exim's code, we cannot guarantee, they wrote, that this exploitation method is unique. Faster methods may exist. They said Exim is vulnerable by default since version 4.87, released on April 6th, 2016. They said when, and then they have some code here, when #ifdef experimental event became #if not def, if ndef disable event. And other versions may also be vulnerable if experimental event was enabled manually. They said, surprisingly, this vulnerability was fixed in version 4.92, released on February 10th, 2019. So anyway, I have a link in the show notes at this point to their comment. Also a note at bugs.exim.org talking about this. I won't go into this in any much greater detail. They have in the show notes I have, for anyone who's interested, all of the details about what they go through. Down at the very end of this, they explain about default configurations, non-default configurations, local exploit, and so forth. But they, under default configuration, which of course is the thing of most concern, I'll summarize this a little bit. They say, we connect to the vulnerable Exim server and send a mail that cannot be delivered because we send more than there's a setting, received headers max. They said we send more than that many received headers in the email envelope. So that causes a delivery fault. They say the recipient address, as in the RCPT2 of our mail, is postmaster, and its sender address, that is the mail from, is, and here's where the exploit is, it's $ curly brace run open curly brace, then the commands they want to have executed as root, then close both curly braces, then @, and then the domain, where that's the domain that is under their control. So basically, it's the mail from. So what happens is, as I mentioned before, it's when this vulnerable server finally tries to send back a bounce message that it encounters this, basically an executable account name at the destination domain, and unfortunately it executes the commands, which are contained in the account name. So then they said, step 2, because our mail cannot be delivered, Exim connects to the target domain's MX, they say, where we listen for and accept this back connection, and starts sending a bounce message to that $run blah, blah, blah target. They say, we keep this connection, that is, its attempt to send a bounce message, open for 7 days, basically preventing it from successfully sending the bounce message for a week. And they say 7 days, parens, the default, quote, timeout frozen after setting in the service, by sending a byte to Exim every 4 minutes. They said this works because Exim reads the response to its SMTP commands into a 4096 byte buffer, which is the deliver buffer size, with a 5-minute timeout. So that is they use 4 to be conservative, to slip underneath a 5-minute timeout. And that is reset every time a byte is read. so that just keeps getting reset to another 5 minutes every time a byte comes in. They just keep it trickling in, and it finally, after 7 days, step 4. After 7 days, we complete our lengthy SMTP response with a permanent delivery failure. For example, they return a 550 unroutable address response to Exim's attempt to deliver the delivery failure message. This freezes the bounce in a function known as post-process1. This function should actually discard the bounce instead of freezing it, which would prevent us from reaching the vulnerable code because it is older at that point than 2 days old, which is the default ignore bounce errors after timeout. But that doesn't happen. In this particular case, the message age is not the bounce's real age over 7 days, but its age when it was first loaded from Exim's spool, when it was just a few seconds or minutes old. So there's a mistake in the code path there. And finally, step 5. Exim's next queue run every 30 minutes by default on Debian loads the frozen bounce from the spool, sets process recipients to recipient failed timeout. This time, the message age is the bounce's real age over 7 days, and executes the vulnerable code and our commands, which is in the original sender address, which is interpreted by expand string that will invoke exec as root. And they said, note, to quickly test this remote exploitation method, the days in Exim's default timeout frozen after and ignore bounce errors after can be replaced by hours, and the default retry rule can be edited. So they're able to speed this whole thing up, basically, in order to run this in the lab and see that this all works. So what we have is we have a what they described as trivial. I mean, yes, it requires a little doing, but it's going to be too tasty for hackers not to play with. The idea that it's kind of cool almost that you send your commands to an email server, you accept its attempt to bounce it back, you hang the attempt for a week, and then it executes the command you gave it as root. It's going to happen. So unfortunately, it could happen to somewhere in the order of 500,000. That is more than half of the email servers currently accepting email on the internet. So for all of our listeners, you don't want you or your corporation to be among those. All you have to do, since if the attack began when this first came to light last Wednesday, you still have a day before a week has gone by if somebody started to attack your server immediately. So sounds like a good idea to update to the latest version of Exim, and you'll be okay.
Yeah.